Hi there, my name is Matti Sulanto and today I'd like to ask, what is your favorite exposure mode? My favorite exposure mode is the aperture priority whenever I'm shooting my personal stuff. And if I'm working for a client, I'm usually using the fully manual mode. When I'm working for a client, I usually set up lights and my lighting stays constant during the whole shoot. And that's why the manual exposure makes sense. When I shoot all the pictures at the same exposure, I can be sure that later when I open the images in Lightroom, I can apply the same adjustments to every image. The reason for me to use the aperture priority for my personal work is that my personal work is a street photography type of photography where the lighting changes constantly. Even if I'm on fully manual mode, I will still choose the aperture first and then my shutter speed and then the ISO if necessary. So it only makes sense to use the aperture priority mode because the automatic exposure then takes care of the exposure, then the shutter speed and the ISO. I'm also using the auto ISO most of the time when I'm on automatic exposure mode. And I feel the aperture value or the f-stop is the most important for my work. It determines the depth of field, and also many lenses behave quite differently at different f-stops. So by controlling the f-stop, I feel that I can control the image the best. I just have to keep an eye on the shutter speed, especially if I'm shooting something that's moving fast and I want to freeze the movement. But sometimes I also use the P mode, especially with small sensor cameras, because with those cameras the aperture value doesn't do much for the depth of field. I think we all want to capture the full tonality of the scene, but sometimes, even though the sensors are really good today, it's not possible. In that case, we just have to decide if we want to sacrifice the shadows or the highlights, whichever is more important. When I'm using automatic exposure, I will use the exposure compensation or the exposure lock to make sure that the exposure is what I want at that specific moment before I hit the shutter. The sensors are so good these days and the cameras are so good that it doesn't matter if the exposure is a little bit off, especially if you're shooting raw. You can pretty much save the image if it's within certain tolerances. I'd say plus minus one stop, and that's no big deal. But I have to say that the automatic exposures are really good in modern cameras. So the exposure is pretty much spot on even without any corrections. So that's my way of working with different exposure modes and my way of getting the correct exposure. Please leave a comment below and tell me what's your favorite exposure mode and how you get your perfect exposure before you hit the shutter. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this and I'll see you next time.